The little silver locket was cold in my hand, its surface worn smooth from how often I secretly traced its swirling patterns with my thumb. It was my favorite secret, my only real treasure. I'd hold it tight in my palm whenever I needed to feel brave, a tiny shield against a world that felt too big and too quiet. And right then, standing at the edge of the hallway, I needed to be the bravest I had ever been in my 8 years. Grandma was in the kitchen, humming a tune that had no real melody, just a low, continuous buzz, like a bee trapped behind a window pane. It was the sound she made when she was busy and didn't want to be bothered. A wall of noise to keep everything else out. The smell of bleach and lemon cleaner was so sharp it made my nose wrinkle. Her house always smelled like that. Clean. So clean it felt like no one really lived there, like all the memories and messes had been scrubbed away until nothing was left but a shiny, empty shell. Our house, the one I barely remembered, used to smell like baking bread and the lavender perfume my mom wore. I crept toward the kitchen doorway, my socked feet silent on the polished wooden floor that reflected the gray afternoon light, like a mirror. She was at the sink, scrubbing the counter with a green sponge, her back to me. Her shoulders were a stiff, unmoving line under her faded floral apron. Her gray hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes, making her look permanently surprised or maybe just tired. "Grandma?" I said, my voice so small it was almost swallowed by the vast, clean quiet of the house. She didn't stop humming or scrubbing. Her hand moved in relentless circles. "What is it, Maya? Can't you see I'm busy?" I took a shaky breath, the cold metal of the locket pressing a small, perfect circle into my skin. Inside it was a tiny picture. A picture I wasn't supposed to have, cut from a larger photo I'd found tucked away in a dusty shoebox in the attic. It was of a woman with a smile so bright it felt like bottled sunshine, with eyes that crinkled at the corners just like mine did when I laughed. My mom. I wanted to ask about that smile. I wanted to know if her laugh sounded like tinkling bells, the way I imagined it. "I miss my mom," I said, the words rushing out before I could lose my courage. The humming stopped. The scrubbing stopped. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. In that single silent moment, a wild hope fluttered in my chest. I imagined her turning around, her face finally soft and crinkly like the old blankets on her bed. I pictured her opening her arms for a hug, a real one, the kind that makes you feel safe and warm all over. But she didn't. Her back, if possible, got even straighter, as if a steel rod had been slid down her spine. She dropped the sponge into the sink with a wet, heavy smack that echoed in the silence. "Don't start with that again," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp and brittle, like a piece of glass about to shatter. She didn't even look at me. She just wiped her hands methodically on her apron, untied it, and walked right past me, her footsteps firm and decisive on the wood floor. She disappeared into the living room, leaving me alone in the doorway, a ghost in my own life. The only sounds left were the maddening drip, drip, drip of the kitchen faucet and the loud, frantic thumping of my own heart against my ribs. The empty smell of bleach seemed to get stronger, filling up all the space where a hug should have been. For a long time, I just stood there, frozen in the doorway, the cold from the floor seeping into my feet. The house was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. I squeezed the locket so hard its edges dug into my palm, a small, sharp pain that I welcomed. It was better than the big, dull ache that was spreading through my chest. Tears pricked at my eyes, hot and angry, but I blinked them back. Crying didn't help. Crying just made Grandma's face get tighter, her voice get quieter. Crying was a mess, and Grandma hated messes. Slowly, I turned and went to my room. My room was the one place in the house that didn't feel empty. It was small, and the walls were a soft, pale yellow that I had picked out myself from a book of paint colors. It was the only time Grandma had ever asked me what I wanted. My stuffed animals were all lined up on my bed in a crooked, cheerful row, and my drawings were taped to the walls. Bright, colorful pictures of things I imagined, like flying dogs and castles in the clouds. There was one drawing I kept hidden under my mattress. It was a picture of a woman with sunny yellow hair and a big smile, holding the hand of a little girl. I shut the door, the soft click of the latch making me feel a little safer. I sat on the edge of my bed and finally opened my hand. The locket lay there, shining against my skin. With a fingernail, I pried open the tiny clasp. There she was. The picture was so small, no bigger than my thumbnail, but her face was clear. Her hair was dark, not yellow like in my drawing, but her smile was just as I'd imagined it. I brought the locket closer to my face, trying to see her eyes better. Were they kind? Did they look like mine? From the living room, I could hear the faint sound of the television turning on, then off again. Then I heard my grandmother's voice. It wasn't the sharp, brittle voice from the kitchen. It was low and thick, muffled. I slid off my bed and tiptoed to my door, pressing my ear against the cool wood. "I know, Helen," Grandma was saying. I pictured her holding the old beige telephone, twisting the curly cord around her finger. She asked again. "Yes, just now." There was a long pause. I held my breath, straining to hear. What am I supposed to say? "I'm sorry, your mother is gone because of a stupid, selfish mistake?" A child doesn't need to hear that. Her voice cracked on the last word, and a sound came from her that I had never heard before. It was a sob, choked back almost as soon as it escaped. "No, she doesn't know anything about that day. And it's going to stay that way. It's better. It's just better." Another pause. I could hear the floorboards creak in the living room as if she were pacing. "I have to go," she said suddenly, her voice back to being clipped and firm. "She'll hear me." The phone clicked back into its cradle. I scrambled away from the door and jumped onto my bed, pulling my knees to my chest just as my bedroom door opened. Grandma stood there, her face a blank mask. She didn't look sad or angry. She just looked empty. "Dinner will be ready in an hour," she said, as if nothing had happened. Then she closed the door, leaving me alone again. But this time, something was different. A stupid, selfish mistake. That day. Her words echoed in my head. New pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know I was solving. The ache in my chest was still there, but now a new feeling was mixed in with it. A fierce, burning question. Dinner was a silent, suffocating affair. The only sounds were the timid scraping of our forks against the ceramic plates and the loud, judgmental ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Each tick seemed to say, "Hush now, hush now." Grandma had made my favorite, macaroni and cheese from a box, but the cheesy taste that usually made me happy felt like thick, tasteless glue in my mouth. I kept my head down, pushing the noodles into little mountains and valleys on my plate, pretending to eat so she wouldn't say anything. Across the small, scarred wooden table, Grandma did the same. I snuck a glance at her through my eyelashes. Her face was as calm and smooth as a stone, but her jaw was clenched tight, and she stared at her plate with an intensity that made me think she wasn't seeing the food at all. Was she replaying that day in her head? The words I'd overheard kept swirling around, a confusing, frightening tornado of thoughts. A stupid, selfish mistake. What kind of mistake? My 8-year-old mind could only imagine simple things. Did my mom break Grandma's favorite vase? Did she run away from home because she didn't want to eat her vegetables? No, it felt bigger than that. The way Grandma's voice had cracked, it was a grown-up secret, heavy and sharp. The words were connected to why my mom was gone. Gone. It was a word that meant nothing and everything. Gone like the sun on a rainy day, or gone like my pet goldfish that Grandma had flushed when it stopped moving. Now, gone had a new, darker shape. It was a secret that made my grandmother cry when she thought no one was listening. I decided then, sitting at that silent dinner table, that the quiet was the real enemy. I couldn't live inside these empty spaces and unanswered questions anymore. If the grown-ups wouldn't give me the answers, I would have to find them myself. I had found the locket in the attic. Maybe there were other things there too. Other secrets, other pieces of my mom, tucked away in the dusty corners where Grandma never went. The attic was my only hope. That night, I lay in bed, my body as stiff as a board under the thin blankets, listening, my ears strained, trying to catch every little noise. I waited for the familiar sounds of the house settling down for the night. First, the muffled murmur of the television in the living room, which finally went silent at 9 o'clock sharp. Then the sound of water running in the bathroom pipes, a long, gurgling sigh. The creak of the floorboards as Grandma walked down the hall to her room. 2 quick creaks, then a pause, then one slow one right outside her door. Finally, the soft, final click of her door closing. But I still waited. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, counting the ticks of the clock in the hall until they blended into a single droning hum. 100, 200. I remembered a story where a character waited an hour, so I watched the glowing red numbers on my alarm clock until a full hour had passed. Only then did I decide it was safe. Slipping out of bed, I pulled on my worn-out sneakers, not bothering to tie the flimsy laces. The house was transformed by the darkness. Long, strange shadows stretched from the familiar furniture, turning the coat rack into a hunched old man and the armchair into a sleeping beast. The moon was bright, and it cast a pale, silvery light through the windows, making everything look ghostly and unfamiliar. I tiptoed out of my room, my heart pounding a fast, frantic rhythm against my ribs. Each creak of the floor under my feet sounded like a firecracker in the overwhelming silence. I held my breath, pausing after each step, my eyes glued to the thin crack of darkness under Grandma's door. I was a spy on the most important mission of my life. The string to pull down the attic stairs was in the hallway ceiling, right outside her bedroom. It was the most dangerous part. I had to stand in the lion's den to get to my treasure. I reached up, standing on my very tiptoes, my fingers just barely brushing against the small knotted cord. My hands were trembling, slick with nervous sweat. Taking a slow, shaky breath, I grasped the string and pulled down, putting all my weight into it, trying to guide the heavy wooden ladder down without letting it slam onto the floor. It resisted, then gave way with a low, drawn-out groan that seemed to echo through the entire house. I froze instantly, flattening myself against the wall, my eyes wide with terror. I was sure the sound had woken her. I waited for the light to flick on, for the door to swing open, for her sharp voice to cut through the dark. But the light stayed off. The house remained deathly silent. With the ladder finally down, a rickety bridge to the unknown, I began to climb, one trembling step at a time, into the waiting, suffocating darkness above. The air in the attic was thick and heavy, like a wool blanket. It smelled of dust, of old wood, and of time itself. As soon as I pulled myself up the last step, the darkness swallowed me whole. For a moment, I was terrified, my hand still gripping the top of the ladder, afraid to let go. Then my eyes began to adjust. A single, small, circular window at the far end of the attic let in a weak circle of moonlight, just enough to turn the darkness from black to a deep, dusty gray. The shapes of forgotten things surrounded me, draped in white sheets like a crowd of silent ghosts. There was a rocking chair, a tall standing mirror that reflected a distorted, shadowy version of me, and stacks of cardboard boxes that slumped against each other like tired old men. My sneakers were loud on the bare wooden floorboards, so I slipped them off and left them at the top of the ladder. In my socks, I moved into the forest of forgotten furniture. My mission was clear. I wasn't here for old junk, I was looking for her. I started with the cardboard boxes, my fingers fumbling with the brittle tape on their lids. The first one was full of old Christmas decorations, fragile glass balls wrapped in yellowed newspaper. The second held stacks of old magazines, their pages warped and smelling of mildew. It was all Grandma's stuff, tidy, organized, and lifeless. I pushed deeper into the attic, toward the back wall where the roof sloped down low. It was darker here, further from the moonlight. I had to feel my way forward, my hands brushing against coarse, dusty sheets. And then I felt it. Underneath a heavy canvas drop cloth, my fingers hit something hard and cool. Leather. I pulled the sheet back, a cloud of dust making me cough, a dry, choked sound. It was a trunk. A large, dark brown leather trunk with brass latches, green with age. It looked different from everything else up here. It wasn't a cardboard box meant for storage. It was a trunk meant for travel, for adventures. Scratched into the leather on top were two initials. A.M. My heart leaped into my throat. Amelia. Amelia Monroe. My mother's name. I knew it from a single folded birth certificate Grandma kept in a metal box with other important papers. A.M. It had to be hers. My fingers trembled as I worked on the latches. They were stiff and my hands were slick with sweat. I had to use both thumbs to push the rusty buttons, and they sprang open with a loud click-clack that sounded like a scream in the silence. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed, listening for a sound from downstairs. The house remained still. Only the frantic beat of my own heart answered. I lifted the heavy lid. A smell wafted out, and it was so unexpected, so powerful it made me gasp. It wasn't the smell of dust and decay. It smelled of old paper and dried flowers, and underneath it all, a faint, sweet scent that I knew, deep in my bones. Lavender. It was the smell of my mom. It was a real memory, not just a dream. My hands shook as I reached inside. On top lay a folded sweater, a soft, deep blue. I lifted it and buried my face in it, breathing in the scent of her. It was her. She was real. This was real. Underneath the sweater was a high school yearbook. I flipped it open, and there she was, in a dozen different pictures, laughing with friends, her hair in a high ponytail, in a cap and gown holding a diploma, her smile wide and proud. She looked so happy, so full of life. It was like looking at the sun. And then I found them. At the very bottom of the trunk, tucked into a special compartment, were two things. A thick bundle of letters, tied together with a faded pink ribbon, and a book. It was a journal. bound in the same dark leather as the trunk, with the single word Amelia, embossed in gold on the cover. I didn't hesitate. The letters could wait. The journal was what I needed. It was her voice. I sat down on the dusty attic floor, my back against the rough wood of the trunk, and pulled a small flashlight from my pocket that I'd thought to bring. I switched it on, its narrow beam cutting through the dark. I opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was elegant and loopy, each letter a perfect curl. And as I started to read my mother's own words for the very first time, the dusty, silent attic and the sleeping house below faded away, and her world began to open up to me. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand, but I held it steady, aimed at the first page of my mother's journal. The first entry was dated 10 years ago. She would have been 16. September 12th, it began. Mom is driving me crazy. She says I need to focus on my studies, that boys are a distraction. She doesn't understand. Michael isn't a distraction. He's everything. When he smiles at me in the hallway, it feels like the whole world stops. We met at the lake today. He gave me a flower, a little purple one. I pressed it in this journal. I hope it stays forever. I turned the page, and there it was. A fragile, paper-thin flower, its color faded to a dusty lavender, was taped to the page. I touched its delicate petal with the tip of my finger. I kept reading, devouring her words, her life. The journal was filled with her. Her fights with Grandma Helen about chores, her dreams of being an artist, her frustration with math homework. And Michael. He was on every page. He had a beat-up old car that was always breaking down. He worked at the gas station after school. He brought her milkshakes and wrote her silly poems. He was the one who gave her the silver locket. June 3rd. He gave me the most beautiful locket today. It's a little silver heart. He said it so I can keep him close to my heart. Mom would kill me if she knew. She says he's going nowhere fast. But she doesn't see him. She doesn't see how kind he is, how he makes me feel like I can do anything. The entries went on for months, a whirlwind of secret dates and whispered phone calls. Then, the tone changed. The cheerful loops of her handwriting became more hurried, more slanted. February 19th. Something is wrong. I've been so tired lately, and sick. I missed my period. Oh God. I'm so scared. I can't tell Mom. I can't tell anyone. March 1st. I told Michael. I was crying so hard I could barely speak. He just held me. He didn't run away. He held my face in his hands and said, "Okay, okay, we'll be okay. We're a family now." He seemed scared too, but he was trying to be brave for me. A stupid, selfish mistake. Grandma's words echoed in my ears. Was this the mistake? Loving someone? Being scared? My 8-year-old heart didn't understand. It just felt sad. My mother was just a girl, a scared girl who loved a scared boy. I flipped towards the end of the journal. The final entries were only a few days apart. October 5th. Michael got a second job. He's saving money for an apartment for us. For the baby. He works all the time, but he comes to my window at night just so he can talk to the baby. He puts his hand on my stomach and tells her stories. I wish my mom could see him like this. Then she would understand. October 9th. Today is our anniversary. 1 whole year. Michael is taking me out for a celebration dinner. A real date. He said he has a surprise for me. I can't wait. I feel her kicking. My little Maya. I can't wait to meet you. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. That was the last entry. October 9th, my birthday. A single tear, hot and heavy, fell from my eye and splattered onto the page, blurring the words, "I love you." That day. It was my birthday. The day I was born. But my mother never got to meet me. The accident. It happened that night. Her selfish mistake wasn't falling in love. It was getting into a car on a rainy night with a boy who was just as young and hopeful and breakable as she was. I don't know how long I sat there, in the cold, dusty attic, my whole body shaking. The flashlight beam had faded and died, but I didn't need it anymore. The moon had moved across the sky, and its pale light now fell directly on me. I closed the journal and held it to my chest. It felt like I was holding my mother. Slowly, painfully, I climbed back down the ladder. The house was starting to wake up. A soft gray light was filtering through the windows. I could smell coffee. I walked into the kitchen. Grandma was standing at the counter, her back to me, just like yesterday. But this time, I wasn't afraid. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the truth. "Grandma," I said. My voice wasn't a whisper. It was quiet, but it was clear. She turned around, a tired, surprised look on her face. Her eyes fell to the leather-bound book clutched in my hands. Her face went pale, all the color draining away until she was the color of chalk. "Where did you get that?" she breathed. "I miss my mom," I said again, the same words as yesterday. But today they meant something different. Her name was Amelia. She liked to draw, and she loved the smell of lavender, and his name was Michael. He gave her this locket. I held up the silver heart. Grandma stared at the journal, then at the locket, and then at my face. Her own face, always so hard and controlled, began to crumble. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. A single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek, then another, and another. She didn't move to wipe them away. "He was driving too fast," she finally whispered, her voice raw with a grief that was a decade old but sounded brand new. "The roads were wet. The police said they never had a chance. She was gone before they even got her out. And you were so small. The doctors didn't think you would make it." She sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her body seeming to fold in on itself. "I was so angry," she said, her voice choked with sobs. "Angry at him. Angry at her for being so careless. Angry at the world for taking my baby girl away. I thought, if I never talked about her, if I scrubbed away every trace of her, maybe it wouldn't hurt so much. I thought I was protecting you from all that pain. But I just built a wall between us, didn't I? I was so busy being angry, I forgot to see that I still had a piece of her right here. I forgot to just love you." I walked over to her, and for the first time that I could remember, I put my arms around her neck. She was stiff for a moment, surprised. Then she wrapped her arms around me and pulled me onto her lap, burying her face in my hair. She cried, a deep, loud, messy cry that shook her whole body. And I cried with her, for the mother I never knew, for the grandmother I was just meeting, and for the years of silence that had finally ended. After a long time, we just sat there, the morning sun warming the kitchen floor. She took the locket from my hand and opened it. She looked at the tiny picture of my mother, and for the first time I had ever seen, a real soft smile touched her lips. "She had your eyes," she said softly. "The house doesn't smell like bleach anymore. Sometimes it smells like the chocolate chip cookies Grandma has started baking. She tells me stories about my mom now, funny stories that make us both laugh. The silence is gone. The journal sits on my bedside table, and sometimes Grandma and I read it together. The house isn't empty anymore. It's full of her. It's full of us. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a message of hope.